Speaking of money, would you like to get into the money of college athletics? I guess would be the
Let's
best
hear it.
way
I
to
know you
say
did
it.
research. You got
I
your
did
calculator on your
research.
desktop there.
I
This is
got
going to be big stuff.
I come prepared, Steve. I come prepared. Okay. So I want to talk about this in a couple of ways. I want to first kind of present my opinion on the state of Penn State athletics through the state of their finances, would be the best way. So for those of you that are catching up, every year, required by the NCAA, Penn State is required to release a report that says, here's how much money we've spent and here's how much money we've earned. Now, they don't have to get particularly granular, but they do get granular down to like sports equipment and travel funds, et cetera. But we don't necessarily know coaches' salaries. Of course, Pennsylvania has the protection for whatever reason around the salary of the head coach, or only of the head coach of the football team and the men's basketball team being known, and we don't really know any other salary for the most part, even assistants within football. I think the most important and interesting note that came out to me, two things that came out to me that stuck out to me, and I didn't necessarily outline them. One of them I outlined, but the other one I didn't. Is now Penn State now generates over $200 million of revenue, which is um, an upper tier NCAA program. Ohio State being another one. To me, it is not surprising to hear, and I think that is also great to hear if you care about Penn State athletics, because you probably do want to be in that portion. What was surprising, actually sitting down and looking at the numbers, because I hadn't really looked at the numbers in a long time, is just how much money Penn State like spends, right? They only made so they spent $202 million last year, and they made a revenue of 126,000, which obviously to you and I is still a lot of money. That would be a great salary to have type thing. But I don't know. That's not necessarily like a lot of money. Now, a year ago, they did turn a $10 million profit. And I think that's probably why we see the spending the way it is. So here's what I'm wondering based on what these numbers tell me. Is this the way spending is going to go with Pat Kraft in the Pat Kraft era at Penn State, where they're going to spend kind of up to that max, but maybe still make a slight profit, so that there's money being pumped into the bank? And is that because this is really Pat Kraft's first full year as being AD? Is that his MO, or was that just because of the $10 million surplus the previous season or previous year? And are we going to find that out next, like when we have this report this time next year? So that was what was most interesting to me at looking at these numbers and kind of contextualizing these numbers. When you went through them, Steve, and I don't know with what detail, was there anything in particular that stood out to you? Because there was another thing that stood out to me, that a couple of people called out.
No, I think it's the spending in general. It's not the spending in general. That's the way large organizations like this function. The rainy day, tucking away money doesn't happen in with the facilities arms race, with all the things they have going on. So no, I don't think. I think that just stuck out. Like it's like giving a kid an allowance, right? They're going to spend what you give them, right? And that's what athletics has always felt like to me, and is part of the reason I could get closer to student athletes being paid, is because everybody else is on their back, right? Everything else is on their back. How about we not do some certain things, but then you can't not do certain things, because then you're losing the race for whatever it is, facility support, whatever else. So I think that's what sticks out when people, and just the sheer amount of money that people are willing to pay for stuff, right? That
Yeah.
it's on TV, dude, or do that. Like it's amazing to me that what that affinity for a sporting event will encourage people to spend.
Well, so let's start there with people spending. Penn State in 2022, 2023, so the Rose Bowl / NCAA tournament year. That's to give you a state of mind. Penn State made $47.9 million in ticket sales from all of its sports, with 41 million of that being football, which obviously we knew that football brings in the most, but then we layer in the other 10 million that people are spending on concessions and you know parking and everything else. And I think this is why, like, obviously it doesn't necessarily work out this way, but like you divide that over a family of four and what the cost becomes, like this is why people gripe about Beaver Stadium concession stands not necessarily being the best in the country. They want to maximize and get the most out of their dollar in the experience. Now, do they have a great experience at the games in the stadium themselves? In my opinion, yes. Like for as much as we nitpick on this podcast about this and that within Penn State football's experience, particularly with the game day experience presentation, I think it's still one of, if not the best in the Big Ten that I've been to, and I've been to every Big Ten stadium. So that was interesting to me. But the number that Ben Jones pointed out that was most interesting to me, and then somebody else kind of in a comment section actually called this out. Penn State essentially would not have turned a profit had they not turned beer cells on in 2022. So
Or they just spent less somewhere else.
yeah, or they would have spent less somewhere else. But that was really interesting, and it's amazing to me that Pat Kraft hasn't gone and knocked on doors or whatever to get beer in the BJC, beer in all of Pagula, beer even in Rec Hall. Like I don't understand. To me, it seems like it feels like a no-brainer decision. Obviously, there's a liquor license. Obviously, there's legal and all of this other stuff that they have to go through. But after seeing these numbers, I mean, it essentially Penn State made 100 or $1.7 million more in concessions, particularly from football, than they did the previous year, all because halfway through the season they turned beer sales on. So we don't even know what the full season looks like and the impact of that yet. And it certainly felt like that was more well known that you could buy beer.
Well, you have Pagula has it in the suites, right?
Mm-hmm.
The suites in the upper level, that upper the suite area. So that's good. Good for them financially. And I have not been to a men's basketball game this year, but I feel like when we saw the Wisconsin game, some dude in the stands was holding a glass that looked, I don't know, a clear glass that looked like, I guess it probably wasn't beer, or we didn't know that they were said there'd be a story about it, I guess. But it didn't look like a BJC cup, like a white cup. It looked like a clear cup that had amber color liquid in it. So I don't know whether I'm missing
maybe
something.
we're wrong then. Maybe I'm
I mean,
wrong.
it's possible, because shame on me for not going to a men's game, but they're on TV. So
Well, and I think it's kind of like we talk about, not to get like weirdly political, but we talk about like weed sales in state. We talk about gambling in states. States are going to do it because they see money. Like you could easily see the money from it. It kind of becomes a no-brainer. So to me, I don't know. I just think you look at the numbers there, and that was surprisingly very interesting. A couple of other interesting numbers. I think the basketball ticket sales number was the most surprising to me out of all of these. It went up over $1 million, all because Penn State had a good basketball team. So that shows what happens when you invest in your basketball program. It might not happen overnight. It might not happen tomorrow, but you build momentum for your program the way Micah Shrewsbury did. And it appears that Penn State fans will return that with ticket sales.
was ticket sales a separate line from the NCAA share thing, like that they get for being there? Or does that show up in the same year? That might not show up to a year down the road.
I believe it there's an NCAA like part, but
Okay.
I think the way I read it was through separate ticket sales. And then the other one that was interesting to me that I think is something to keep an eye on is two sports as ticket sales grow. One of which is built a relatively newer stadium and gets you to pay attention to them a little bit more, or at least this sport is growing. The other one, I think, is starting to get a foothold in this state specifically. Men's lacrosse essentially doubled their ticket revenue year over year, up to 18,000. Obviously not a ton of money for Penn State in the grand scheme, really a drop in the bucket, but interesting to note that it's growing for a program that is kind of growing in a sport that is growing. And additionally, the one that I'm most interested in is I really feel like women's hockey is going to be the next it sport, so to speak. And I think that's going to be a gateway for more girls to get their attention into hockey. And that went up about 50%. Their ticket revenue went up 50%. So
Well,
good
and they
for
were
them.
both They were both, well, lacrosse
Easily.
for sure was
Yeah.
free in your lifetime at some point, and women's hockey was darn close to free the first year if it wasn't.
Yeah.
So yeah, so and I think that was something they did probably 10 years ago. For some other sports, they started charging tickets just to say, okay, coaches, you're going to make $5,000 extra somewhere through the year. At least you can do something with it if you sell the tickets. And it was kind of on them to drive interest and help market and sell those things. So yeah, there's not much free as it relates to Penn State athletics anymore, from tickets to any part of it. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. That's just the way it is.
I don't mind it. I don't mind it as long as people don't get priced out, particularly for sports, the lower or the non-revenue driving sports, the way football or and I
No,
mean
and I
I do
think their
mind it for
coaches would
football,
would
but
would
you know what I mean.
be careful of that as well. Like, hey, we can't increase this too much and nobody's going to show up. Like at some
Right.
point, it's not a value.
Right. So I think that was interesting. Um, the other thing that was interesting that I was curious about, going back to our NIL discussion, is the contributions, which is your Lion Club contribution for your tickets, only essentially went up like $1 million year over year. With NIL existing, this kind of being one of the first really bigger years of NIL, in my opinion, at Penn State. Um, it's interesting to see that there wasn't necessarily a drop. I don't know what it grew. Like, you could go look it up, but I don't know what it grew previous years, if that was a smaller growth amount. So I think that's going to be an important number to keep an eye on in the
Well,
future.
and that grew in some part too, because I think they added. I don't think I had a hockey contribution until this season. Like I
Okay.
didn't have to have an NIL Nittany Lion Club contribution to get my hockey tickets until this season. Was the first season I remember seeing that.
Okay.
So there's probably a decent chunk of that, realistically.
Yeah, and I do know that, we talked about this a little bit on Twitter this week, but the season ticket went up contribution for most of the lower bowl, really everybody's seats, for by $100, or at least the north end zone all the way wrapping around. Um, to me, that is your gas money for your athletes going to the West Coast. That's what that is. Like, it's very apparent that that's what that money line is for. So those were the relatively interesting numbers that I saw. Um, that was it, that in terms of revenue. So between TV tickets and the contributions, that's essentially a little over about 60% of Penn State's revenue for the year. So that's interesting to keep in mind. Now, expenses. What going back to what surprised me, and something that maybe you've harped on and griped on a little bit. The number one cost for Penn State was not head coaches or coaches' salaries. It was support staff slash administrative compensation at $39 million. So essentially, for every dollar that you make through Penn State football ticket sales is going out the door towards administrative and support staff. Um, Interested to see that number and the way that number grows or doesn't grow, or I think that's just I wonder what I would also like to get that number and compare it to other Big Ten schools, because that feels particularly high. Um, Not discrediting anything people do, but I don't know.
Oh, it might be where other people are. Although, I mean, again, men's basketball, just because I wrote it the past week, you got a 17-person support staff. That's who makes the website, and a couple of them I get it are graduate assistants, but they're still listed as the support staff. You got a 17-member support staff for men's basketball? Like, I'm just not, and it's the same way with the athletic department. Again, the number of student athletes who've been added at Penn State is 2 hockey teams in the past 30 years. The number of student athletes otherwise has been the same. Somehow, some way, those teams were competitive in the landscape that existed then, with much fewer people making sure they somehow succeeded. So, and I know the world's changed. It's just amazing to me, the growth, maybe bloat is the wrong word, the administrative creep that has happened in athletics across the board everywhere, because it's not just Penn State. I don't know. It's a little unbecoming on the backs of the kids in some ways. I mean, it's to me, as like you said, it's something I've chimed in on before. It's even worse than the other stuff that's happened on the kids' back, because these are actual people who are like, oh, just here to support you. Thanks for making my job possible. I don't know. Just
Yeah,
feels weird.
it would be interesting to almost have like a survey, right? Like, do, and you see this from time and time again on like Twitter and like, and I think football is the outlier in really anytime we talk about these numbers, football is very much the outlier because they're gonna get most of that money. Um, but like fencing or tennis, golf, those sports, like do those kids feel the same support that wrestling, hockey, football feel? That would be what would be interesting to me. And I think about that just even visually in terms of the facilities that are available at Penn State. Um, so that was interesting. The other thing that was the one of the more surprising numbers of all of this, so $23 million goes towards room, board, and tuition for Penn State athletes. With the number two team being women's hockey, at like 1.2-ish million. And it just was kind of a surprise. It makes sense because they've got a lot of athletes and the way their scholarships get divided up. Um, but it was kind of an interesting little nugget if you've never really paid attention to that.
They knew that when they came in. I mean, that's why they tried to pitch an equestrian team as a way to balance out instead of hockey. Like, I mean, it
Yeah.
wasn't a foregone conclusion that there was going to be men's and women's hockey when it first started. But a couple administrators kind of, I think, went to the mat to make sure the women's hockey team became something. Because otherwise, that there really wasn't the Pagula gift wasn't for both sports. It was for men's hockey, and athletics had to find some stuff for the women, and they knew that they were going to be costly going forward.
Yeah, I think that
So they
was
should win some games and drive some attendance to help pay that stuff
yeah.
back.
And I like the way that program is headed. Let me see, look at the other interest. $5.2 million on sports equipment. $5.2 million. Now, I don't know if that's like all the I would assume that's not necessarily the Nike stuff. That's like footballs and like sticks and pads and etc. But that's a lot of money. I mean, it makes sense, but that's a
31
lot of
teams, stuff's
it's
not
a
cheap.
lot of money. So that one was interesting. Um, and let's see what else was interesting in there. The other thing was the essential, like, not this disparity, probably. Yeah, no, it's a disparity. Let's call it what it is, between men's and women's sports. So 17 million goes towards men's head coaches, with 7 million of that being for James Franklin, and I think maybe like 3 million, or I might be overinflating that number off the top of my head, be it for going to
Electrodes.
Mike Rhodes. But only 3.9 million goes towards head coaches of women's programs, um, which is that was a bit surprising to see. Um, that wasn't as even as I necessarily would have thought it would be. Of course, it probably more aligns to where the money comes from, and um, you know, none of the women's sports are really revenue producing in the same way that the men's sports are at Penn State.
Right. And I think that's always the Title IX challenge, that stuff and whatever, those numbers and what does revenue producing mean versus, just plain old equity. And it translates up to the WNBA. I was listening today with when they talk Caitlin Clark a little later. The average salary in the women's NBA is like $81,000, right? And people are like, that's not very much. Well, that's what the market is bearing, apparently. Like, there's not going to be millionaire in terms of playing salary, WNBA stuff. There's probably not going to be millionaire women's coaches, except for a small handful across the country.
And I wonder what I would be willing to bet at least 99% of those. I gotta think maybe even 100% of those of the highest paid women's coaches are basketball, right?
I
Like
would think so. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I can't of the top, let's say top 20. Um,
I'd be surprised if there was two in the top 20 that weren't women's basketball, perhaps, of the highest paid collegiate women's coaches.
yeah, I wonder. It it would be it would be very interesting as somebody that's generally curious. It would be very interesting to see what each of the head coaches make. We don't know that, but would be very interesting. Um, so that was relatively it for the numbers. I hope we could kind of provide some context around them and what we saw, what was interesting there. Anything else you want to add about the old financial report?
No, related, but not related. So I forgot to tell you, I was actually at an event this weekend, not on the Penn State campus, on another major university campus, sat in the hockey arena to watch Penn State lose. And what was interesting is what wasn't there again. We've had this conversation about Notre Dame and some other places. Nothing was for sale inside for sale. There was lots for sale. There was nothing for sale on the dasher boards or the ice that wasn't Notre Dame, which, and I don't think the money's that significantly different. It's just interesting what places monetize and what they choose not to monetize, and what their look and feel is like based on that.
It's always kind of jarring to watch a Notre Dame hockey game, specifically because of that, because you don't see the ads. Like your brain is so trained to see those ads on the boards there, and they don't have them. They're one of the few schools in the country that doesn't have ads there.
Yeah,
Maybe the only one that I can think of off the top of my head.
it took me a second too, like, because one of the ads is kind of set up. It almost looks like an Anderson Windows ads, because that's what my mind looks like with the fightingirish.com. And I was like, I elbowed Susan. I'm like, hey, what do you notice about the arena? She's like, what do you mean? She's like, I'm like, well, you can't see it, but once you see what you can't see, you won't be able to unsee it.
Right.
And she's like, what are you saying? I'm like, give it a second. And she's like, oh yeah, that's right. Like, there's nothing. I get it.
Did they have ribbon board ads?
No ribbon board. No
Nothing on
ribbon
the
board at all.
scoreboard.
Nothing on the scoreboard.
I would like to go to
The
that
only ad
facility.
was a pregame. They had a pregame slap shot thing for $250 that they brought 3 people out on the ice. But even, I don't even know if there was stuff on the Zamboni. I don't think there was stuff on the Zambonis.
That's interesting.
So,
I mean,
yeah,
it makes sense for there. I mean, they're
it is. And I get it. It's just, but I don't think they're making so much more from the NBC and Peacock deal. Like, I still think they're making less than Penn State is, but they don't have 31 sports to pop up either.
yeah. No, that's true. They don't have as many sports there. Which is interesting. I think about that a lot. Like, think about that with Penn State, particularly in this whole boom of women's wrestling, right? Like, it makes sense for Penn, like geographically or not ethically, but I don't know what the word is there. It's in the ethos of Penn State in Pennsylvania to get a women's wrestling team going. Lock Haven has one, for Christ's sake, and Iowa has one. Why doesn't Penn State? But then you kind of like have to like look at these numbers, right?
Right.
Um, so yeah, all right. That's about it. That's about it for that stuff.